Hey, everybody, welcome in a Thursday edition of the Utopia Football Podcast. I am Sean Pendergast, one half of Payne and Pendergast on Sports Radio 610. Great to be with you on a Thursday edition of the podcast. I wanted today to do a semi-deep dive on not just the Nico Collins extension, but also kind of what it means, how good a deal it is, and where the Texans are at in terms of roster building. And just what a remarkable last really 14 months this has been in terms of the transformation of this team. And I think the Nico Collins contract is a definite significant chunk of that in a few different ways. So I'm going to devote today's episode to that. We'll be back on the mailbag guest sort of two-pronged podcast structure next week, Tuesday and Thursday. But the Nico Collins contract came down on Tuesday after I'd already recorded Tuesday's mailbag episode. So I'm sure there's a ton of mailbag questions about the Nico extension that we'll dig into next week. But for now, I wanted to give you my take on it. And as we speak, as this is recording, the Texans are on the field at OTAs, kind of wrapping up an OTA practice, which included Stefon Diggs. Diggs was on the field for the Texans today. So I think that's a great sign as to where Diggs is at mentally in being a Texan. And there have been no signs to indicate that he's anything but excited to be a Houston Texan. But that said, we haven't heard it straight from Stefon Diggs yet in a press conference setting. So maybe that's something we get today as well. So we'll see. But I think that's probably the news of the day, at least, is that Diggs is on the field with his teammates today at what'll be the final OTA session. And it will lead into mandatory minicamp next week. So any question of him being at mandatory minicamp, Stefon Diggs, appears to be answered today. If he's at voluntary OTAs today, then clearly he'll be at mandatory minicamp next week. And I was never really that concerned about it. So good news there on the Texans front. Now, the big news this week has been the contract extension to Nico Collins. 3 years, nearly $73 million. It can max out at 75. So we'll just call it 24 to 25 million a year, which puts Nico Collins seventh. Well, at the time of signature, seventh among average annual value for wide receivers contractually. And I think since then, in the last 30 minutes or so, as I record this, Jalen Waddle got an extension from the Miami Dolphins. Jalen Waddle drafted the same year as Nico Collins, has put up bigger numbers than Nico Collins, obviously, as most of these top-tier wide receivers that are getting deals have put up better numbers than Nico, because Nico was banged up and played in a horrible offense for 2 years. He was finally healthy, playing in a good offense last year, and you see what he did, and that's why he got paid. But Jalen Waddle got a deal for slightly more than Nico. Nico got about $25 million a year. Jalen Waddle got about $28 million a year with more guaranteed money. So that already pushes Nico down to eighth. So if you're somebody, this is what I would tell you about this deal. First of all, I like the deal for Nico Collins. Back in February or March, when rumors began to bubble up about Amon-Ra St. Brown of Detroit being in talks to get a contract extension for about $25 million a year, I think 3 years, 75 was what the rumor was. I tweeted that I would do that for Nico Collins. I don't know that a lot of people agreed with that at the time, thinking that Nico had only really done it for 1 year. And I honestly, those are probably people who don't like this deal now. There are Texan fans who are skittish about this deal. I'm not one of them. I think that I don't necessarily hold all of what happened in his first 2 years in the league against Nico Collins. Clearly the Texans are not either. And I tend to look at what he looked like last year, because that's what it's going to look like moving forward. And I think the thing about Nico as well is, man, he showed he can do it at any level of the route tree. You know, he was a deep threat at times this year. He was tremendous over the middle. He was great on bubble screens, great on slant routes, run after the catch, breaking tackles. There might not have been a better wide receiver in football when it came to running tough after catching the football, taking big hits over the middle. That's Nico Collins. So I like this deal. The Texans have the cap space to do it. You're not paying CJ for at least another 2 years, CJ Stroud. So I like the deal. If you're somebody who is hung up on where Nico's getting paid and where his salary ranks among other wide receivers, again, as of signature, it was seventh. As of today, it's now eighth because of Jalen Waddle's deal. Nico could be pushed down to 13th or 14th by the time the regular season rolls around. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Brandon Ayuk, CeeDee Lamb are all expected to either get deals or if they don't get deals, not be very happy with their current employers. So we're either going to get new deals pushing Nico down the list, or we're going to get some good old-fashioned drama for teams that aren't the Texans. And I like that too. So I think conservatively, Nico will be pushed out of the top 10 by the time the season rolls around and maybe even further down the list, which I think accentuates how good a deal this is. Now, if you're somebody that just isn't as enamored with Nico's skill set as I and others are, then there's probably nothing I can do to convince you. But I think the direction the receiver market is going, they've got Diggs signed up for just 1 year here at $22 million. We'll get to that in just a second. But I like this deal for the Texans. I like it for Nico. I like it for CJ Stroud. This is yet another piece that is attached at the hip chronologically to your young, budding superstar quarterback. So I like it from that standpoint as well. Thumbs up on the Nico Collins deal. And again, like I said, a few months ago, I said I would have done 3 years, $75 million. That's about what it ends up being. So that's good news in my mind for Texan fans. Now, as far as the ripple effects go of this deal, let's start with Stefon Diggs, who, again, as we're recording this, has made his first appearance at a Texans practice today. He is practicing with the team. There's video that surfaced from numerous media members who are out there. I unfortunately couldn't be out there today because the OTAs conflicts with the end of my show. By the time I get out there, practice would probably be over. So I'm recording this podcast for you instead. But Diggs is out there practicing with his teammates. I have always thought that the Stefon Diggs relationship with the Texans was going to be a short-term one. I thought that when they originally traded for him and he still had 3 extra years after this year, unguaranteed on his deal. I never thought Stefon Diggs would be somebody who on the Texans or any other team was going to see the end of that contract. The Texans made Stefon Diggs, they ripped up the last 3 years of that deal, as we know, and essentially made him a 1-year, $22 million contract, and he's a free agent after this year, which I think is good for the Texans. They're going to get the best version of Stefon Diggs, i.e. he's out at practice today. And I think it's good for Diggs. You know, if he shows out this year, then I don't think anybody's going to pay him tippy top money, but he'll get one more big deal. You know, maybe one more deal in that $20 to $25 million a year range for 2 or 3 years, which is good money for a receiver who's going to be 31 or maybe 31 already. But I think this deal with Nico Collins hammers home that this is probably going to be a short-term thing with Stefon Diggs. If Diggs has a good season, he may want more money than the Texans are willing to go with 2 wide receivers. And let's keep in mind, too, Tank Dell is lurking in the weeds, too. I know Tank needs to stay healthy, and he needs to put in a full season. But when we've seen Tank on the field, he's the guy that changes everything for this team because of his ability to get open and his ability to get downfield, his ability with the ball in his hands after the catch. I mean, I feel like we can say that about all 3 of these guys, right? Nico, Tank, and Diggs. But a Tank, it feels like a guy that they want around long term, even after just one truncated year. I am saying that. So I think I felt it was already going to be a short-term thing with Diggs. To me, the Nico Collins extension increases the chances that Diggs is only here for 1 year. I am okay with Diggs only being here for 1 year. I know there's a lot of people out there like, you gave up a second-round pick for 1 year of a guy, which they did. My response to that would be, 1, he's a pretty good player. So let's agree on that. Like, this is a guy who could completely change things and flip things for you here this season. Diggs is a guy who could take you from a very spicy offense to a lemon pepper habanero spicy offense. Okay. Also, and I think how you view the Diggs trade in terms of what was given up probably mirrors how you view money that you've come into, right? And what I mean by that is there are people who are come into some degree of money, you know, like they all of a sudden they find themselves with an additional $500. You know, they got a bonus they weren't expecting or something like that. And there are many people out there who would then take that and pay down some debt, save it, invest it, put it in throw it into a mutual fund they've got already, i.e. something that would be viewed by society as responsible with that money. Then there are others, when they get found money, they go, you know what? I wasn't expecting this money. This is extra money on top of the money I already have. I'm going to go get something nice with this. I'm going to go to a nice steak dinner. I'm going to go buy myself this flat screen TV 80-incher that I've been looking to get, whatever. I'm more of the latter category. I'm somebody that when they come into a little extra money I wasn't expecting, or I feel like I'm getting, it's extra that I maybe got because of my acumen, my brains, and I'm like, okay, I wasn't expecting this. I wasn't expecting to be this smart. Okay, I'm someone who would go buy something for myself. Is that a flaw? Maybe, but it's how I'm wired. I think that's how the Texans view that second round pick that they traded to get Stefon Diggs. That was a pick they got from Minnesota for moving down from 23 to 42 in this draft. So it's not like they gutted their draft. They had an extra second round pick next season. So they still have a second round pick. They have their own. They traded Minnesota's in this deal. And I think the Texans feel like, look, this is kind of found money for us. We moved back 19 spots in a draft where we feel like the player we were going to get at 42 isn't all that different from the player we could have gotten at 23. And so it's kind of found money and extra money. So instead of sitting on it and drafting a young player next year who may or may not work out, they decided, hey, man, it's found money. Let's go get this 1 year of Diggs. And so I think that's how it is. Like, I would say if you don't like that they gave up a second round pick, I basically run your credit for me. I want to see your credit report. Essentially, if you're probably responsible with your credit and paying it down, you didn't like the Diggs trade. If you're a YOLO guy who likes to suck the marrow out of the bone of life, then you probably like the Diggs trade. I'm more of the latter, a marrow-eating YOLO motherfucker, all right? And so that's how I view the Diggs trade. And I'm cool with it being 1 year, and I think Nico's deal makes it more likely that it's 1 year, all right? So that's that. So I like the deal for Nico. I think Diggs is probably a one and done here, and hopefully it's a fun one. I think the only scenario in which Stefon Diggs remains a Houston Texan beyond this year is if this team doesn't necessarily have to win a Super Bowl, but I think displays that they are going to be one of those teams over the next few years that are going to be in that conversation every year. You know, they're viewed like the Chiefs and the Bills and the Bengals are right now, and the Ravens in the AFC. Like, they are hard and fast one of those teams. They're going to dominate the AFC South. I think if they're that and Diggs is willing to work with the Texans a little, I could see him being a guy that stays here for around 10 or 12 million a year if he's willing to do that. But I don't think the Texans have the wherewithal, especially with some of the expensive contracts coming up on the horizon, and we'll talk about that in a second, of paying Stefon Diggs like Stefon Diggs may want to get paid in the final, like what his one last go round with free agency is going to look like. All right, so that's that. So love the deal. Diggs one and done. I think this is a significant one too, as we start to look ahead to the next couple of years. A big congratulations to Nick Caserio. This is his first hand-selected, drafted player that he's drafted that he's given a second contract to. This is a success story. You know, that it's somebody who's getting a near top of market contract shows you nailed it with that pick. In a draft where you were picking 67th overall with your first pick and you took Davis Mills, you traded up to get Nico Collins, you came away from a 5-player draft. Like, Bill O'Brien left you with nothing. A 5-player draft, and you walk away with a guy who's a Pro Bowl caliber wide receiver. Now we'll see what happens with Brevin Jordan and Davis Mills. My guess is that Nico will be the only 2021 draftee still left on this team after this coming season is over. But that's okay. That's okay, because this roster is much deeper than it used to be. As far as second contracts go, this will obviously not be the last one coming up here in the next few years. I think if I'm taking all of the players Nick Caserio has drafted, not this most recent draft class, because they haven't even had one preseason game yet, but of the guys that Nick has drafted in 21, 22, and 23, I think we can close the book on 21. I think Nico will be the only one. I think the two locks, like even if injured, I think these two are both locks to get big second contracts with the team, unless it's a career-ending injury, obviously. But C.J. Stroud and Will Anderson, I think they would sign the two of them up now if they could, to some sort of deal that was, you know, that didn't torpedo the cap. Like, I think C.J. Stroud's going to get a deal the summer after his third season, and I think you could see that happen with Will Anderson as well, which doesn't happen very often with non-quarterbacks, but we just saw it happen with Nico Collins. First round picks are a little different because you do have that 5th-year option sitting out there. Like Nico, they had to get done because he would be a true free agent after this coming season. But CJ and Will, the team really controls them. I mean, they're drafted in 23, so the team really controls them if you include franchise tags. I mean, for 7 years, if you wanted to go 2 years on a franchise, you could go 3 years on a franchise tag, but that third franchise tag year is absurd as far as cost. I think CJ and Will are locks. I think if they're healthy, Derek Stingley Jr. and Tank Dell are locks to be second contract Texans. I think that the team and the front office would really like for Jalen Petrie to play to the level they expected when they drafted him, because I think they would love to be able to make him a long-term Texan, but that's a tough putt right now with 2 very uneven seasons for Jalen Petrie. And maybe that drives the price down a little bit. Maybe Petrie is not as expensive as these other guys. I don't think Petrie is he certainly won't be as expensive as Stroud or Anderson or Stingley. You're talking about top 3 picks in their draft classes, but I think they want Petrie to be that guy. And then I think the 2 other guys that I'll be interested to see play out over the next couple of years, Christian Harris, linebacker who was really ascending at the end of last year, had the pick 6 in the Cleveland game. And then Juice Scruggs, who was, kind of drafted alongside CJ Stroud, drafted to be the center for CJ Stroud. So does Juice Scruggs develop into somebody where the Texans want to keep him around long-term? Center feels like one of those positions, flies under the radar a little bit, but if you get it right, that's a guy that you like to keep around, especially if you've got an elite quarterback who has a relationship. It's a little like a pitcher-catcher kind of relationship. So I think Juice is a guy to keep an eye on. Former second-round pick. That would be one that I think if he plays, if he's Chris Myers, right? Chris was a really good player, Pro Bowl player towards the end of his career, real leader for the team, just super solid in this same system. If Juice Scruggs is Chris Myers by the end of his rookie deal, they're going to want to keep him around. So those are the ones I would keep an eye on of the guys that Nick has drafted. CJ and Will, total locks. Stingley and Tank, I think pretty close to locks. Tank may have a little more work to do and show that he can stay healthy, and Stingley that he can stay healthy as well. Petrie, I think they really want him to be around long-term. He needs to play better. And then Christian Harris and Juice Scruggs. So that's like 7 guys to keep an eye on. So that's my other thought on that is Nico is going to be the first of what I think we're going to start to see every offseason now, because the Texans have drafted well and these guys are developing, and Nico has a staff that develops them. If you're looking at what topics are going to be this time of year, I think there's going to be at least 1 or 2 guys every year where we're like, okay, should the Texans extend him? And those are positions I think too, to keep an eye on what else goes on around the league. You got to keep an eye on what the next couple quarterback contracts look like. It's looking like CJ may be the first guy to crack $60 million a year. Defensive ends, edge rushers, got to keep an eye on that. That's going to be Will Anderson in a couple of years. Wide receiver, we already know what direction that's going. Safety, things like that. So, cornerback, $20 million is about top of market right now. That's probably what Stingley is going to be looking for if he A, stays healthy, and B, has a season this coming year like he did the last 8 games or so of last year. All right, so that's another thing. Second contracts to keep an eye out for. So love the Nico deal. Diggs a short timer. Second contract frenzy is coming up these next couple of years. And I think to that end, I think one of the nice things is we're starting to see a nucleus get built here. We're starting to see, whereas it's the last couple of years, last 2 or 3 years, been a lot of short timers, right? Been a lot of journeymen, especially early on in Nick Casario's tenure. And that's not Nick's fault. He was inheriting a really bad football team. But now we're starting to see guys, not only draft picks who are inherently here if they're good for at least 4 years, but we're starting to see the team make more than 1-year commitments to guys. 3 years to Dalton Schultz, 3 years to Azeez Alshire, 3 more years for Nico. And if you look at this now, you can start to see, okay, these are if the Texans start doing some big things the next several months, as early as the next several months, but certainly over the next few years, these are going to be the guys that are the foundation for this. CJ Stroud, Joe Mixon is here for 3 years. Dalton Schultz is here for 3 years. Nico Collins is going to be here for 4 more years, including this one. His extension doesn't kick in until next year. Tank Dell is here for at least 3 more seasons. So there's your skill positions, right? Quarterback, running back, tight end, 2 of your wide receivers. You're locked down for 3 more seasons at least. Offensive line. Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard, their 3-year extensions they signed last year kick in this year. They're with you for 3 more years if you want them. And if you don't, you got Blake Fisher waiting in the wings who you drafted in the 2nd round. Shaq Mason signed a 3-year extension last year. He's here for the long haul. You drafted Juice Scruggs. He's got 3 more seasons. Boy, if Kenyon Green plays anything like he looks out at OTAs, then all of a sudden you're wondering with Kenyon, okay, he's got 2 years left on his rookie deal, but he's a first rounder. Could they do a 5th-year option? Now I'm getting way ahead of myself. But my point is, you may have at least 4, if not 5, offensive linemen available to you for the next 3 years. Like literally your whole offense, other than Diggs, is locked up through 2026 at least. That is construction right there, man. That is, and there aren't any deals that are killing you either. Now, when CJ gets paid, it starts to get a little harder to put that kind of strong mortar into this roster. But boy, as far as taking advantage of a rookie contract, Nick Caserio is putting on a masterclass right now in doing just that. So it's fun. And then on the defensive side, not as much locked down on the defensive side because you got some older players over there. You maybe you haven't drafted as well over there outside of the 2 top 3 picks that you have. But Will Anderson is obviously a long haul guy. Stingley, if he stays healthy, is a long haul guy in the secondary. I think Christian Harris has that potential to be a long haul guy. Azeez Alshire is a guy that you signed up for 3 years. You're the leader, the brains of your defense, the guy who's going to have the green dot on the back of his helmet. So I think that's the Nico signing is sort of a catalyst for really a reminder of where this team is now compared to where it was even as recently as a year ago, but certainly where it was 2 and by God, 3 years ago, where this thing was roster-wise. I mean, if you want to really appreciate where this team is, go back and find some YouTubes of the David Culley era, of a practice, of a press conference, of highlights of a game, and really appreciate what the transformation that has taken place with this football team. So nice to see. I mean, I just rattled off about 12 to 15 names there. That's your nucleus. There actually is a nucleus for this team now, which includes one of the best quarterbacks in football. So that's really good to see. And I think the last thing with the Nico Collins signing, the Nico Collins contract extension, is this is the latest step in the, I'll use the word again, masterclass that Nick Caserio and the Texans have conducted in how to set up your young quarterback for success and surround him with weapons. Here are the moves chronologically the Texans have made on offense since drafting C.J. Stroud with the 2nd overall pick, okay? And you tell me at the end of this if this is not just classic building and taking advantage of your resources around a quarterback. The very next day, they draft his center, his future center, Juice Scruggs. Now, we got to see how good Juice is, but the intent, they draft Juice Scruggs, and then a few picks later, they draft Tank Dell. 2 nice young pieces to grow with C.J. Stroud. A few months later, they signed both of his tackles, Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard, to 3-year contract extensions that take them through 2026. So that's last summer. And Shaq Mason, too. I'll add that in. So 3 of his offensive linemen get signed to what in this NFL I'll call long-term deals. They're signed through 2026. Then in free agency this year, they bring back Dalton Schultz and sign him for 3 more years. So now you've got a center, you drafted a wide receiver, you lock in the offensive line for the next several years, and you lock in a tight end that CJ kind of got to do a 1-year trial run with and clearly built chemistry with. And Dalton Schultz really likes it here being a Texan. Sign him up. So now you got your tight end. So the offseason continues in 2024. What else do they do? They trade a 7th-round pick for Joe Mixon, and they lock him up for a few more years. They make the trade for Stefon Diggs, and now you are the envy of the entire NFL, certainly the envy of a lot of quarterbacks around the NFL. And then just a couple days ago, you extend Nico Collins to make sure that he, the most prolific wide receiver that CJ had with him last year, is locked up through 2027. So this is just, I think the building of the nucleus and the foundation is just one of those things that happens over time. The more guys that you sign, this feels much more purposeful in terms of surrounding CJ with what he needs. And then I would say spending some of that money on the defensive side of the ball. Look, you need a good defense to be a good offense as well. It's got to be a balanced thing. So I think just the right spending on Daniil Hunter and Danico Autry and Azeez Al-Shire, those are all things that maybe don't affect CJ snap to snap as directly as the offensive guys do. But they're all things that go to the heart of building a balanced team where not all of the pressure is on CJ Stroud to put a cape on every week. So that's phenomenal. So again, just to summarize here, I really like the Nico Collins deal a lot. I think it probably reduces the chances Stefon Diggs is here long term, and I'm okay with that. Be ready for the wave of second contracts coming here over the next few years, because they're coming and they're going to be pricey. It's going to be much more of a hard puzzle to put together for Caserio and company in a couple of years, but it is great to see this nucleus getting put together, and it's really cool to see a GM do all the things that the fans clamor for, really. Like, we've all been clamoring, like, oh, you gotta spend while CJ's on his rookie deal. You got to go get him weapons. They did. This is a quarterback that had the best rookie season of any rookie quarterback, maybe in the history of the game. And it would have been really easy for Nick and D'Amico to say, well, we can just lean on CJ and then throw everything onto the defensive side of the ball. And make no mistake, they spent defensively, but that they were still mindful of that small gap that CJ can still go fill to get to his ceiling and make it easier for him. I think it's just a great example of this team being so well run right now, and it's great to see. All right, so those are my thoughts. Thank you to our producer, my producer, Anthony Irwin, getting this podcast out to you. Hope you enjoyed that. Some deep thoughts on a monumental contract here for the Texans and for Nico Collins himself. So big thanks to Anthony for getting the podcast out to you. If you want to send an email for next week's mailbag, houmailbag@gmail.com. That's houmailbag@gmail.com. And I read them all. I don't read them all on the podcast. If they're good, I get them on here, but I read them all, and I appreciate the kind words. And while you're at it, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. Subscribe and get you the podcast automatically sent to wherever it is you listen to your podcast. So I am Sean Pendergast. We are out of time. By the way, Nick Caserio will be joining me and Seth Payne in studio next week on a date to be determined, but the podcast, we'll find out about that as well. So until then, have a great weekend. I am Sean Pendergast. We're out of time. We'll see you later. Thanks for listening to the Utopia Football Podcast.